Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Crawford County Historical Society and A250PA Crawford County's largest event thus far of the American semi-quincentennial. We are on a college campus, so I will be that obnoxious professorial type. And can everyone say semi-quincentennial once? So by the time we're done, you'll have it all figured out. And if you believe that, I've been saying it for 2 or 3 years worth of planning now, and I still haven't gotten it right most of the time. So that said, we have a very special guest here with us. I will introduce in just one moment, but unfortunately for you, given that you are a captive audience, and I have to thank a few of the great people that helped pay for all this. So that said, the year of events, and I'm talking our bus trip to Philadelphia, which there is information on the back table. There's just a few more days before the deadline if you'd like to join us there, where you may possibly get to see Scott again, or at least see where Scott works. Other upcoming events, fireworks on the 4th of July, which is, I promise you, the largest check I've had to write at the Historical Society in some time. A parade through downtown Meadville, events in Spartansburg, Conneautville, Springboro, Titusville, you name it. We are thrilled to be from the Ohio line to the oil region, but that all takes commitment, and I'd like to thank a few people for that commitment and for that generosity here in Crawford County. The largest presenting sponsor is the Rick and Daniel Lang Family Foundation, and without their support, a lot of the work that we are doing wouldn't be possible. So I'd like to thank them for presenting this event, them and Allegheny College, who is serving as the venue and the sponsor for many of the events as part of the America 250 celebrations. So can we give them a round of applause for a moment? There are many beyond those two, though, that have made events like this. There's a full calendar in the back on the table that you're welcome to take home that is 4 or 5 pages long. And there are many sponsors that made all of that possible. The Carriage House Inn, which we'll chat just a bit more about in a moment, Channel O'Toole, the City of Meadville, the Crawford County Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Historical Society, Erie Bank, Highland Bed and Breakfast, Howard Hanna Bainbridge Kaufman Real Estate, hello to our friends over on the left there, the International Association of Firefighters in Meadville, the Meadville Fraternal Order of Police, Northwestern Rural Electric Cooperative, Seton Catholic School, several private individuals who have asked to remain anonymous, but very much have a commitment to this area and want to see programs like this continue. Vantage Healthcare and Westbury Methodist Retirement Community. So thank you to all of these fantastic local organizations, individuals, businesses, etc., for all they do in the community now and year-round. That said, a little bit of an order for the evening and a few things coming up. We'll introduce Scott in just a moment. After this event, for those of you who either purchase tickets or would like to purchase tickets for the meet and greet, it will be, rather than at the Baldwin Reynolds House Museum, it will be at the Carriage House Inn at 241 Locust Street. For those of you who look puzzled, there are a couple. If you're at the Baldwin Reynolds House, right next door is the old Phi Delta Theta Fraternity House. The Carriage House Inn is the original carriage barn for the Heidi Copers that is directly behind. So you can get to it from Locust Street. If you have a GPS on your phone, you can see the address right in your program. Also, you can park at the old fraternity house right next door to the Baldwin Reynolds House Museum, and there is a gate right in that parking lot that'll take you right up through the yard to the bed and breakfast. So it's easy to find. They reached out and were thrilled to be able to host us for the evening. And it's a fantastic, it used to be, as I mentioned, the Heidi Copers when they were internationally known breeders of horses. It was their main barn and carriage house, and it's gorgeous to see what they've done with it now. That said, a week from now at the Tippie Alumni Center, we will be celebrating Dr. Armindia P. Dixon, who I saw in the audience this evening, Lynn Cressman of Titusville, Dr. Heather Moore Roberson, and Amanda Scott on the 28th from 4 to 6 p.m. Tickets are still available at the Leaving Her Legacy Award. The Historical Society is a firm believer, as part of Women's History Month, that rather than just celebrating those who came before us, kind of like saying nice things to people before you're at their funeral, we'd like to thank a few people in the community while they're here to hear about it. So join us for that. April 14th at Highland Bed and Breakfast, Alex Rigby, who's from the Sagertown area originally, has written The Nature of Our National Parks, and his book launch will be part of the Crawford County America 250 activities. It is free to attend. Registration is required, and you will be able to find that on the Historical Society's website in the next day or two. They just got me that information. Again, April 23rd through 26th, would love to have you join us at the Historical Society's first bus trip. That'll be to both Valley Forge and Philadelphia. We'll be at the National Constitution Center, we'll be at Valley Forge, we'll be at the Museum of the American Revolution, we'll be at McGillen Tavern, the oldest tavern operating in Philadelphia, and we'll also be at Carpenter's Hall, where the First Continental Congress convened, but we will be there for, not just for a tour, but for dinner as well. So join us for that. And now I have taken advantage of my captive audience long enough. I would like to introduce a hometown individual who has done some fantastic things to help people be both not just enriched and educated, but inspired by our nation's history, especially on this semi-quincentennial. I told you, try to memorize it. We'll have it a few times tonight. Born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Scott Stephenson holds a bachelor's from Juniata College and a master's and PhD in American history from the University of Virginia. But before all of that, he was visiting Hickory Street, where his grandparents lived here in Meadville. His broad public history experience spans nearly 3 decades and has been marked by public and professional acclaim for his creative and innovative approaches to engaging audience. From 2002 to 2007, he served as curator of the Senator John Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, where he developed the International Traveling Loan Exhibition Clash of the Empires, the British, French, and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. In January 2007, the National Center for the American Revolution, now the Museum of the American Revolution, engaged him as a consultant to assess the fledgling organization's collection and develop a vision for the museum's core exhibition. He was hired as the first director of collections and assisted the museum as a key member of their senior leadership team, raising approximately $175 million, surpassing the original capital goal of $150 million, to make a museum dedicated to the war that founded this country a success. In November of 2018, Stevens was named the president and CEO of the museum. In addition to these professional accomplishments, he's a passionate outdoorsman, enjoying wilderness canoe tripping and fly fishing. We have some of that here, if you're wanting to stay a little longer, if you can squeeze it in. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife, Dr. Donna Stephenson, Associate Professor of Neurology at Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. The couple have 2 teenage children. How you find time to do all of the things. I'm guessing the woods is very much the place that you can finally think. But that said, you've paid to come here and not to listen to me speak. So, on that note, can you please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Scott Stephenson. Okay. No problem. And there's water behind you.
And that's the clicker.
Yeah.
Let's see if it works. I realize I won't be able to see what's on the screen if I don't stand out here. Is that working for you? My mic? All right. Not on? If I speak like this, as if it's Sunday, can you hear me? Whoop, that's not working though. That's not clicking. I have done an interpretive dance version of this talk before, which maybe, does it need to be on a surface maybe? My batteries are not dead. I'm just getting started here. Now, there are two kinds of nodding at lectures like this. There's the nodding like this. I will keep talking as long as there's this kind of nodding. At some point, if there's nodding like this. Okay, here we are. Fantastic. I could hold this. Yes. How's that? Want to sing like Sinatra? All right, I bring you greetings from 3rd and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia. This is about as far as you can be from Meadville and still be in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Actually, I was in Erie this morning. That is literally as far as you can be from Philadelphia and still be in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So here we are, we're 2 blocks from Independence Hall, Museum of the American Revolution. We are only 9 years old, so we're about to celebrate our 9th anniversary on April 19th. So we're still a restless and audacious upstart here. Now, which thing did you actually press, Josh? There it is, on the left side. When I walk out my office onto the terrace of the museum, this is the view that I have. What you're looking at is the first bank of the United States, founded by Alexander Hamilton. This is the first federal building built under the United States Constitution, completed in 1797. It's undergoing a massive restoration right now. It actually, like 5 years ago, it did not have functioning security system, HVAC, and fire suppression. Can you believe this? So it's had a big federal grant. They're redoing it. It's got a new, beautiful roof. It's going to be reopened to the public in time for the 4th of July. So probably not when you all are down there, and I hope everybody's going to be on this bus trip, by the way. But you will see the fantastic First Bank of the United States. If you were floating about this high above the street in 1906, and you look south on 3rd Street, can you spot the bank right here? Okay. So this neighborhood was, despite what New York would tell you, this neighborhood is where the foundation of the American financial system took place. The Bank of North America during the Revolutionary War, the first bank of the United States, later Stephen Girard's bank. So it was a very important location for the American financial system. Also a neighborhood where publishing industry, the national sort of publishing industry, the Saturday Evening Post, all the great publications of the 19th century, many of them were founded here in Philadelphia, and daily and weekly newspapers. And so the building that's just close to us here next to the bank was the site of the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin. So the story, and I'm going to take you on a long ramble through 250 years here, but we're starting kind of at a midpoint here, 1906. The Evening Bulletin in August of that year carried this headline: "Sacred relics to aid charity. General R.E. Lee's daughter," you all know who General R.E. Lee was, "will sell 2 tents used by Washington to aid the Confederate home. Wants to raise $10,000. Not a small amount of money in 1906. So we're going to come back to that to kind of explain what's going on here, and that's going to lead to telling you a little bit about the origins of the Museum of the American Revolution. But we have to go all the way back to 1775. Many of you will be familiar with John Trumbull's dramatic painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place on June 17th of 1775. And that's a week which the Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, made a couple of decisions that were absolutely critical. The first decision was they got together, and all these New England militiamen some of you are descended from them, I know, had fought the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th of 1775. They had pushed the British back into Boston. They had begun building forts and bottling up the British. But it was not automatic that the rest of the colonies were going to say, yep, we're on board with this. So there was some debate in Congress, and they finally decided, okay, typical Yankees up there, they start a fight and they need help to finish it. And so Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, we're all on board. So they vote that week to adopt that New England Army and make it the Continental Army. They vote to raise 10 companies of expert riflemen in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, in Virginia, and send them north to join this army to try to restore Americans' rights, their English liberties. This is not about independence yet. That's going to take another year. And they have to put someone in charge of that effort. And John Adams from Massachusetts knew the leader of that force had to be a Southerner, because you had to bring these different parts of the colonies together. And so that's where the guy you all know and love, George Washington, comes into the story. Now, George Washington, of course, is known for his French and Indian War exploits as one of the most experienced colonial Americans at the time in terms of his military experience. Although those locals of us from Western Pennsylvania know that was not a particularly distinguished career, starting a global war, being defeated at the Battle of Fort Necessity, et cetera, et cetera. It all turned out fine in the end, but he had the good sense to retire early and marry the richest widow in Virginia and become really a Virginia colonel. But he shows up to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia in May of 1775 wearing a uniform. And you're seeing a painting of him wearing that uniform. The colors, blue and buff, are symbolic. The Whig Party in Britain was the traditional party that was associated with English liberty, of being against having kings who were thought of themselves as dictators. So in other words, supporting the rights of Parliament, balancing that of the king. These were the Whig colors. So there's a political symbolism to the colors that he chooses. He also is the only congressman who shows up wearing a uniform. So he was sort of he's not saying, you know, vote for me, but he is signaling that he's ready to go if you vote for him. And so he's given a commission as commander-in-chief of that Continental Army. This is his original commission from the National Archives. You know, it's not just on the Declaration of Independence that John Hancock's signature is pretty big. And so he's given that commission, puts it in his pocket, and he's going to set off from Philadelphia, accompanied by the cavalry of the 1st City Troop, still an active National Guard unit in the Pennsylvania National Guard, the longest serving, continuously serving military unit in the United States military, and they head north toward Boston. Their first port of call is going to be New York. This is where something really important happened. It's going to set up a theme that's going to go through my talk tonight. Now, Washington rides into town, and he's treated, you know, with great pomp and circumstance, essentially given the keys to the city. But the New York Provincial Congress, which is the body that's replaced the old, you know, royally appointed governor. This is the provisional government that's come together to with the, you know, revolt going on against king and parliament that's overseeing New York. And they write an address to Washington. This is the 26th of June in 1775. So follow in with me. They rejoice in the appointment of a gentleman, Washington, from whose abilities and virtue we are taught to expect both security and peace. We have the most flattering hopes of success in the glorious struggle for American liberty, and the fullest assurances that whenever this important contest shall be decided, by the fondest wish of each American soul and accommodation with our mother country. That's a reminder. This is not about founding an independent nation yet. This is about restoring our rights as Englishmen. This is the important part. You will cheerfully resign the important deposit committed into your hands and reassume the character of our worthiest citizen. What are they thinking about? Well, unlike many of our young people today, and maybe even some of us here, no, it can't be the people here because you all love history. These were keen students of history, and particularly classical history. They believed themselves as British subjects, that they were part of the greatest empire and greatest political system since ancient Rome. And so they read books like Livy, and they read these histories of ancient Rome. And what that taught them is that there were guys like this in Roman history. And you've heard of the guy on the right, Gaius Julius Caesar, right? So there was a practice during the Roman Republic in which there were times of great public danger. when invasions would come, when there would be rebellions, where the Senate would give dictatorial power. They literally used the term dictator, which they gave to a military leader for a fixed period of time, with the understanding that then, when the emergency had passed, it would be passed back to civil authority. But absolute power, as you know, has the potential to corrupt absolutely. And so occasionally, there were these examples where men did not give that power back. Most famously, of course, Julius Caesar. In fact, if you think back 10 years earlier, at the beginning of the events that would really lead to the outbreak of war, the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, the very dramatic fellow in the red cloak is Patrick Henry. And he gives a speech to the House of Burgesses, where he is denouncing the action of Parliament in daring to tax Americans directly from the action of Parliament, where colonial Americans had no elected representation. And he extends that critique to the king itself, and that's crossing into some pretty hairy waters there. And so the part of the speech that everyone remembers is that Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I, his Cromwell, and George III. And if you were all the members of the House of Burgesses, some of you would be crying out, treason, treason. They were like, don't go there. So he says, and George III, pause, may profit by their example. So just to say that these people who are making these decisions, who will become these revolutionaries, they have been taught by their reading of history to be very concerned about too much power in an executive. And they are now detaching themselves from this political system that they considered to be the freest. When they looked at Europe at the time, absolutist France and Spain, these were places where you did not have suffrage, you did not have representation. And so Britain was really the exemplar of liberty, but it was corrupt, they believed, and they wanted to restore their role there. And they're thinking, as we're giving Washington this power, there's a real danger of giving someone that power. So Washington's letter back is absolutely masterful. And the first line, I think, is not well known, but something every American should remember. He writes, "When we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen." And you all have heard about America and its citizen-soldier tradition, and it really comes right back to the very first weeks of the Revolutionary War. He goes on to say, we shall most sincerely rejoice with you in that happy hour when the establishment of American liberty on the most firm and solid foundation shall enable us to return to our private stations in the bosom of a free, peaceful, and happy country. So he's saying, I hear you, I promise. Once this is over, I'm going to go home. Now, Washington makes his way the first couple days of July 1775. He arrives at Boston, and this is, it's kind of hard for those of you who know Boston today because the whole Back Bay has filled in, but in the 18th century it was just this little isthmus, almost like an island connected by a narrow isthmus to the mainland. And you might be able to make out these little kind of like squares and rectangles and lines. Those are the fortifications that those New England soldiers had built in the month after Lexington and Concord. And they're bottling up the British Army that's there in Boston. And on the left-hand side, in Cambridge, around what's now Harvard University, was the center commanded by General Washington himself. Now, see if this sounds familiar. I think every single time a people go to war, they think, this is going to be over really quickly, right? Remember 1861, all the people in Washington, D.C. ride their carriages out to see what would become the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, and this is going to be kind of fun to watch, and then it's all going to be over by dinner time. And that was not the case. Of course, 750,000 men are going to be lost in the field of battle before that war was over. Well, by the early fall of 1775, as the armies begin to go into what they called winter quarter. So armies did not tend to fight through the winter, partly because the gasoline for their vehicles, in this case hay and grass for horses is dead. And so the armies tend to go into winter quarters, and the campaigning season is sort of like June, July, August, September. By October, you're starting to think, all right, where are we going to sleep this winter? And so it's clear that this conflict is going to go on for another season. So Washington, when he left Mount Vernon to go to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, the news of Lexington and Concord had not reached that far south yet. So he came with a uniform. He did not bring his camping equipment. So he's got to get ready to take the field. He has to create a mobile field headquarters. And so he sends his aide-de-camp, Joseph Reed, who was a Philadelphian, to the place everybody shopped in that time, which is Philadelphia. He's going to bring dispatches back to Congress, report on the condition of the army and the situation, and then start going to all the different tradesmen in Philadelphia to put that mobile field headquarters together. We know a lot about what he purchases because Washington had promised to serve as commander-in-chief for no pay, but that Congress would reimburse him his expenses. Now, it would not be the last time in American history when those expenses went a lot deeper and farther than Congress had expected. But good for us as historians, they kept a lot of the paperwork, and so the expense account survives. And so we know quite a bit about what he purchased. He writes in, this is in March of 1776, so sort of as they're getting ready, anticipating taking the field again, he writes to Reed, says, "I cannot take the field without equipage." In other words, what's going on with my tents and such. And then I love this line. He says, "After I have once got into a tent, I shall not soon quit it." So he's not only promising sort of on the political side that he understands what he's been entrusted with in terms of this, this power, this military power as commander-in-chief, but he is also promising, I am going to stay in the field. And again, unusual for European generals of the time who kind of disappear. I mean, even when they're campaigning in America, a lot of times they sail back to Britain for the winter to, hang out with the family and et cetera. And, most soldiers are not seeing them. But he's making that promise right at the beginning. So what we know is that he purchased a pair of what were called marquees. And here's two 18th century engravings that actually are very similar in appearance to what we know he purchased. On the top is what was known as a dining marquee. So picture that as a big sort of 23-foot long, 24-foot long, big oval-shaped tent, about 14 feet wide, about 12 feet tall. It's one entrance in the end. You walk in, it's just basically a big canvas room that you can meet in, you can dine in, multi-purpose meeting room. The tent below, slightly smaller by a couple feet on each side, is his personal sleeping and office tent. This is his private space. It's actually broken up. It has a central room, about 8 by 10 feet. Under one eave on the right side, his bed is tucked in there and has its own little chamber. On the left side, his enslaved valet, a man named William Lee, who Washington had purchased from the Lee family when he was a teenager, actually, and would literally be the only person freed immediately upon Washington's death in 1799, accompanied him through his entire adult life. William Lee inhabited that tent as the personal valet for Washington. Now, 1776 starts on a high note. Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. Everybody's full of this liberty talk. Congress declares independence on July 4th. They actually declare independence on July 2nd and then issue the Declaration of Independence 2 days later to explain what they had done 2 days earlier. But while that's happening, the empire is about to strike back. Bobbing in New York Harbor are over 400 warships and transports with more than 30,000 British and Hessian troops and tens of thousands of British sailors and munitions, and they are coming to bring us back. And so by the end of that campaign season, so beginning in August, the end of August, 1776, with the Battle of Long Island, and then through a series of about a dozen actions, by the first week of December, 1776, Washington's army has dwindled from maybe 20 or 30,000 troops to about 3,000 troops. Their enlistments are going to all be up at the end of December. So he's only got a couple weeks of service of these men. They are retreating through New Jersey. This is the painter Howard Pyle's interpretation of Washington's army marching in retreat through the Jerseys in the late fall of 1776. Thomas Paine, who had written Common Sense and published it in January of 1776, is with the army marching through the Jerseys. I don't believe you. There it is. This is when he writes The Crisis, and that famous line you all know, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this time of crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he who stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman," on and on and on and on. He's literally writing that on a drumhead camped along the road in New Jersey as Washington's army retreats across the Delaware River. Not the painting that you've all seen of Loitza, but this depressing moment of retreating into Pennsylvania, expecting the British Army to march into Philadelphia. Congress leaves Philadelphia and flees to York, Pennsylvania. Everyone thinks the game is up. Richard Stockton, one of the signers of the Declaration, actually says, "Oops, I was kidding," and he takes an oath of allegiance to George III. It's that bad. So, at the end of December 1776, of course, you know Washington turns it around by crossing the Delaware. The first battle of Trenton, there's a couple days later, they cross the Delaware again. The second battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, this is the 10 crucial days that kind of breathes a little bit of life back into the Revolution. In the midst of all of that, Congress does what the senators had done in ancient Rome. They grant Washington free, ample, and complete powers. They make him essentially a dictator. So he has the authority to appoint military officers himself without going through Congress. Now, up to that point, if you were an officer, you had John Hancock's signature, or you had Charles Thompson's signature. Super excited to see a Charles Thompson document down here, who was the Secretary of the Continental Congress, reminding you that your commission, you derive your military authority, your power as an officer from Congress, not from General Washington. He doesn't have to worry about that. He can decide if you are, Bill Schneider, are a traitor to the United States. He does not have to refer to civilian authority. He can command you to give up, he can seize your private property and put it to the use of the army. And he's given 6 months that he's given this dictatorial power. Now, you think they were scared a year earlier in 1775. This is an act of incredible desperation. We forget how dangerous. We think, oh yeah, you know, Mayflower, Bunker Hill, America was always meant to turn out the way it did. So, let's read just a teeny bit of Washington's letter to Congress. He says, "Instead of thinking myself freed from all civil obligations by this mark of their confidence, I shall constantly bear in mind that as the sword was the last resort for the preservation of our liberties, so it ought to be the first thing laid aside when those liberties are firmly established." So again, he's saying, I know you guys are really worried about this. I believe in this cause. I am going to treat this incredible power that you've given me with great respect, and I promise I'm going to go home. I know you don't believe me. I'm going to go home at the end of all of this. The other thing that you start to see at this moment is the other promise that I told you about at the beginning here, the quote about the tent, is that Washington is staying in the field with his army through all of this. So here's a quote from one of his old Virginia regiment buddies from the French and Indian War, who's a brigadier general now here, just a few months later in May of 1777, reporting home to someone in Virginia that His Excellency, our good old general, has also spread his tent and lives among us. Here's Washington watching troops marching into Valley Forge. This is a painting you probably are all familiar with. It's from our collection at the Museum of the American Revolution, but really one of the most evocative paintings, I think, literally showing the bloody footprints in the snow as the army is marching into Valley Forge. But here are Washington's general orders just 2 days earlier, that he himself will share in the hardships and partake of every inconvenience. Washington sleeps in that tent until January of 1777 because he wanted to wait until the soldiers were actually under huts that were being constructed from all the trees that they're cutting down. He wanted to show them that he would be the last person to take the comfort of a home. Now, by the middle years of the war, it's not just Americans then who are watching this extraordinary man. Europeans who are also keen students of history at the time, and particularly on the continent, the French aristocrats are like, we are seeing a reenactment of ancient history in front of us. Like we are watching their understanding of history. Revolution, means a turning, right? The assumption is that in political history of societies, there's like a primitive state that then becomes more complicated, right? And there's a rise of authoritarianism, and then it will go back again. So they're seeing history in a revolution here, and they are all wondering, what is this guy actually going to do? So this is an engraving of George Washington published in 1780 in Paris. I know it's hard in the back row to see what you're seeing here, but Washington is standing in the midst of a military encampment. He's standing in front of his marquee tent. William Lee, his valet, is holding his horse at the ready. He's got all the trappings of his military equipment. He's standing on, in great disdain, conciliatory bills. Attempts by the British to bring the Americans back into the fold, promising them, we were kidding, actually. I mean, literally in 1778, they say, you know what? We're going to turn the clock back to 1763. Parliament's not going to tax you. Basically, they offer them what will become the Commonwealth of the 19th and 20th century, like Canada, where basically, as long as the king's on your currency, we're good. And they're like, we have crossed the Rubicon. We're not going to do that. Washington is holding in his hand a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Treaty of Alliance with France. And then underneath, it says, Le Général Washington, and then the Latin translates as that the state shall receive no harm, right? So again, they're referring back to the Roman Republic. It's sort of hopeful at this point, and they're all wondering, does he really mean it? So there's Washington again. Something that's interesting is when he arrives in Boston in 1775, that uniform is the uniform he wore, with the exception of this blue ribbon that's over his shoulder. One of the things he finds when he gets to Massachusetts is, first of all, New Englanders. I hope there's not too many New Englanders in the audience. New Englanders are extremely democratic, like so democratic that the men elect their officers. Now, someone coming from an aristocratic society like Virginia, the idea that you would walk through camp and there would be a captain shaving a private was unfathomable. The Virginians and frankly Pennsylvanians, most of the rest of the colonies were probably much culturally, in terms of military culture, much closer to the British Army than they were to these crazy New Englanders. And so Washington realizes, first of all, nobody knows who I am. So he purchases a ribbon to distinguish himself by. And so that's a blue ribbon. It actually survives at Harvard University because it was given to the painter Charles Wilson Peale, who actually painted more portraits of Washington. It actually was a Peale family industry by the end of the Revolutionary War, cranking out portraits of this remarkable man that everybody wanted a picture of. What's interesting is the ribbon disappears. This is a portrait that Pennsylvania commissioned in 1779 to hang in Independence Hall. They took down the picture of the king. They wanted to replace it with the commander-in-chief, and there you see his ribbon over his shoulder. The problem is there was another guy named George, King George, who wore a ribbon that looked a lot like that. Now, by now, you should know enough to go, I can see how somebody might be a little confused about this. If you look at later portraits of George Washington, here's one, again, by Charles Wilson Peale, same artist. This is commemorating the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, and Peale, again, puts Washington in front of his tent. There's French and American officers accompanying a surrendering British soldier in the background, but there's something missing, isn't there? Right? Very plain, Whiggish, Republican dress. We know that in the middle years of the Revolution, there was a rumor circulating that secretly the French had made Washington a marshal in the French army. Now that's essentially giving him diplomatic immunity. So you can imagine that the officers serving under him, who might be expected to be treated as rebels, right, if they were captured, and the men, if all of a sudden the guy in charge kind of has this secret get out of jail free card, that's going to undermine his authority, right? And actually we have a French officer who really in 1779 talks about formerly on solemn occasions in the days of battle that he would wear this ribbon, but he has given up that unrepublican distinction, right? So Washington, even in his dress, trying to look very plain in his dress. He wants to be able to be recognized, but he wants to distance himself from these aristocratic traditions in Europe. And so here he is at the Siege of Yorktown. One of the great bromances of the Revolutionary War is he and a guy wearing a red ribbon, in this case, General Rochambeau, French General Rochambeau, who bring their armies together in 1781 when they have an opportunity to trap a British army under General Cornwallis against the sea in Yorktown, Virginia. And this is a map that was engraved and published in Philadelphia in 1782, kind of showing the siege lines. And right down in this area, there's Washington's tent, there's Rochambeau's tent. I love that they use the icons of the tents for the headquarters of the two generals. Now, here's a painting at the Museum of the American Revolution that commemorates that moment. The original hangs at Versailles, the French Palace of Versailles. There is the Hall of Mirrors you may be familiar with if you've traveled over to Versailles, and the Hall of Battles. At the other wing, that is a series of paintings commissioned in the 1830s that commemorate great French military victories stretching back to antiquity, some of which probably actually did happen. This one definitely happened, and it's the only one there that commemorates a North American scene, and that's the Siege of Yorktown. So you see General Rochambeau, Washington, this is Lafayette and the door of the marquee. So here's a map that roughly shows you, this is the 95 corridor from Boston to Williamsburg, Yorktown. If you've driven it, you know you can't drive more than about 5 minutes, right? Washington slept here, Washington slept here, Washington slept here. So this is the scene of a lot of this 8-year conflict. After the Siege of Yorktown, the French army stays down in the Williamsburg, Yorktown area. Washington marches his army back to what we call the Hudson Highlands. So this is the area between like Newburgh, where West Point is today. There was a place called King's Ferry, which stretched from a point of land called Stony Point. Some of you who are military buffs will recognize that. And Verplancks Point on the east side. This is the first narrowing of the Hudson River north of New York City. So south of that, you kind of need like a sailing ship to get across there. It's subject to winds and tides and can be quite treacherous. When you get to the Narrows and the Hudson Highlands, that's where you can have ferry crossings. And the British, throughout the Revolutionary War, their strategy was to try to capture and control that corridor. Because their theory, and it may have been rooted in truth somehow, is that the real troublemakers in this were all the New Englanders. That if it was the reasonable people of New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey and Virginia that surely would return to their loyalty to King George, if we could just get those Yankees detached from the rest of them. And so if you could control that Hudson River, you could separate the cancer from the rest of the body. So that area was fought over continuously through the Revolutionary War. Forts built, besieged, captured, taken, back and forth, lots of fighting taking place. And that's where Washington then brings his army, and he's got about 10,000 troops up in the Hudson Highlands. Washington never recovered from the embarrassment of losing New York in 1776. To the very last moment, he is dreaming and scheming and drawing up plans. He dreamed of seaborne invasion, essentially like a Normandy invasion of New York. It would have been an absolute bloodbath, and his generals kept saying, no, we can't do this, hang on. But that area was the scene of one of the most important moments of the Revolutionary War. And I bet most of you were taught the Revolution begins in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, and then Yorktown, and it's kind of over. But remember that it's 2 more years till 1783, September of 1783, before the Peace of Paris formally ends the war. And this is a very dangerous moment. The war, because of France and Spain and other powers in Europe, the Dutch, etc., making this a global conflict. So now there's fighting going on in India, in the Indian Ocean, on the west coast of Africa, and in the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, you have sugar-producing islands that economically are much more important and much more valuable for these European empires than even all of North America was at this point. And so a lot of the fighting then, a lot of the troops are being pulled down into the Caribbean. So in 1782, the summer of 1782, the French decide they're going to send a fleet to pick up those French troops to take them down to the Caribbean and fight the British in places, to threaten Jamaica and other British territories in the Caribbean. Now, I'm a historian and I have a PhD in history and I read this stuff a lot. I cannot figure one thing out. The plan was to pick up the French army, which was here, and take them to the Caribbean, which is that way. But they're ordered to march to Boston to get picked up by a fleet to sail to the Caribbean. Strange, I know. But what that meant is that the French army is going to march, reverse march the way they had come down to Yorktown, and they're going to cross at King's Ferry here in the late fall of 1782. Now, I'll just flash this up quickly to say what I'm about to tell you here is a story that we actually just pieced together like around the time the museum opened by finding this amazing watercolor. What you're seeing is a 7-foot-long panoramic watercolor of the Continental encampment at Verplancks Point in September of 1782. And if you really dig in and you look in the background, there are hundreds of soldiers' tents in there. There are officers' tents in the foreground here. This came up about 2 weeks after the museum opened in 2017. And I'd spent 10 years researching the story of this tent. And we never found an actual eyewitness image of Washington's tent in the field. You would think, as important it is, of all the people who are writing about it, wouldn't you think somebody would have done a sketch? Lots of people writing about it. So this thing is on an online auction called Heritage Auction. Some of you who are antiques people probably haunt it. And you click on it and you look at it, and at first, of course, because of the scale, you're kind of like, what am I looking at there? But you could click on the different parts and it would pop up enlargement. So this comes up. And if I had a defibrillator, it would have gone off. Because here is Washington's tent. And I knew it was Washington's tent because it's on a high piece of ground. The Hudson River is off in the background. There are hundreds of tents across the field there. And I remembered people writing who were there. So this is one of the people who's at Verplancks Point, and he's talking about opposite the camp, which would be over there. On distinct eminences stood the tents of some of the general officers, over which towered predominant that of George Washington. There it was. Now, why is that important? Well, there's this great quote. This is a French officer who was with Rochambeau's army, and he's writing in his diary during this very period. He says, General Washington was on the point of taking a house, meaning for a headquarters, when he decided to set an example to his soldiers by living in camp. He's so much adored that even the foreigners, meaning the French, who see this extraordinary man cannot resist according him their admiration and respect. So think about this. The war is winding down. Nobody would have begrudged Washington if he decided to sleep under a roof somewhere, but he sets that tent up, not just anywhere. He picks the highest spot so that 8,000 soldiers, the first thing they would see when they climb out of their tent in the morning, The old man's up there, standing there looking at me. And the last thing they saw, if they looked over their shoulder as they climbed into their tent at night, was the candle still burning up in Washington's marquee. So I love to look at these two pictures. You're very familiar with Peale now. And admittedly, these are by two different artists, and they are artists' interpretations. On the right, a portrait which you will all see when you come to Philadelphia on display at the museum by an American artist named Joseph Wright. Washington sat for this portrait in November of 1783, right in the last encampment of the Continental Army. He painted this copy for the Powell family of Philadelphia. Their house is actually right down the street from the museum. It still survives. The Powells were very close friends of Washington. Washington stayed there numerous times, friends with them when he comes back to Philadelphia as president. According to the Powell family, the oral tradition passed down that General Washington considered this portrait very like, but not flattering, which is like every vacation picture at the beach that I have ever taken. So that tells you that's probably what he actually looked like. And I want to sort of contrast that. You all are used to probably seeing this juxtaposition of Abraham Lincoln. That's just 4 years apart. And he was sleeping in the White House, not in a tent for most of that time. And so looking at this portrait to me and looking in those eyes, I see a man who has been away from home for 8 years, who has taught the Army what is the cause that we're fighting for, has reassured civilian authority that you guys are a bunch of knuckleheads, but you're still the boss, right? And in March of 1783, in Newburgh, New York, a group of officers start meeting clandestinely. They're very disgruntled. Many of them haven't been paid in years, and the troops haven't been paid. Some of these officers start to say, you know, Congress, useless. The American people, they don't care about us. Maybe we should move west across the mountains and just let the British Army march to Philadelphia. Or maybe we should elevate Washington and make him a ruler or even a king, the new King George. And Washington gets a whiff of this. And he shows up at a meeting that they're having. Now, can you imagine? They were like, we are in trouble, because the old man walks in and goes up to the podium, right? And he's not looking very happy. And he delivers a speech that has come down to us known as the Newburgh Address. And actually, the original draft of that, the paper that was literally in his hand, written out in his own hand, survives at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I actually have held it in my hand, and it's one of those things that you just feel an electric cord going through your body as you look at this. And Washington delivers this speech, and part of it, reads, he says, "I've never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty, I have been your constant companion and witness of your distresses." And then he says, I have a letter that I've received from Congress making promises about that they're really trying to get money to us, et cetera, and he's going to read it to them. But in an incredible piece of political theater, he reaches in his pocket and he pulls out a pair of spectacles and puts them over his nose. And he says, "You'll excuse me, I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." And we have a lot of eyewitness accounts of this moment, and men who had literally charged into the mouths of cannon wept at that moment. And he saves the Republic in one of these moments that through all of history, this is the dangerous moment of a revolution, getting armies to disband, generals preventing them from becoming dictators or kings. And so the Newburgh Address is, again, probably the first moment in which this republic, which has faced so many challenges since then, is pulled back from the brink. So Washington goes to Annapolis to return that very same piece of paper to Congress. Now, you know why they're meeting in Annapolis? It's not because crab cakes are better down there. It had become so dangerous for Congress to meet in Philadelphia because disbanded soldiers with muskets and bayonets are walking the streets saying, "I would like to see my congressman," right? Literally. So they moved to Princeton to try to meet there, and it was dangerous there as well. So they literally flee, and they're meeting in Annapolis in the State House there. And that's the scene in December of 1783 when Washington returns that commission, the promise that he had made 8 years earlier. You can't even make it up. He got home on Christmas Eve of 1783. This is why Washington is known as the American Cincinnatus. Again, hearkening back to the ancient Roman Republic. Cincinnatus was a consul who was given that dictatorial power not once, but twice, and then returned to his farm after saving the Roman Republic. So we name cities after Cincinnatus, right? We have a Society of the Cincinnati who are descendants of officers of the Continental Army as well. Washington, of course, also does this twice. He is called back as president of the Constitutional Convention. He will become president. He's really the only person probably that could have been entrusted with the power to become the president, because under the federal Constitution, the Constitution is not a long and detailed document, as we are reminded still 250 years later today, right? And so he's so important in inventing, how the presidency will work, what the cabinet will do, setting the precedent of only serving 2 terms, and then again handing power back to the people. This is President and Mrs. Washington during the presidency, and these are Martha's grandchildren by her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. And this little boy here, named for his adopted grandfather, George Washington Parke Custis, will be sort of the custodian of the legacy as it moves forward. Now, Henry Lee, of course, a very close friend from the Stratford Hall family in Virginia, Lee's, eulogizes Washington when he dies in 1799 as first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. And I hope you have a little bit more depth now of like what that really meant to the people at the time. So here's GWPC, as we call him, George Washington Parke Custis, around the time of the War of 1812. By now, George Washington has died in 1799. Martha Washington dies in 1802. Much of the wealth that had come from Martha Washington's first husband, and that included more than 200 enslaved people, that wealth had only been held in trust during Martha Washington's lifetime. And George Washington was the trustee. He was charged legally with managing that property, but he did not have the power to make decisions, including to free enslaved people. They were held in trust for the next generation. And so George Washington Parke Custis would inherit a lot of that wealth. He would build a house opposite the new federal city named for his adopted grandfather, Washington, D.C., called Arlington, named after an ancestral home in England. And he would write, these are just images of newspaper accounts and manuscript accounts, and actually a drawing of Washington's tents on display at Arlington. Arlington became a kind of showplace for all of these relics of Mount Vernon. And Custis, frankly, did not do a tremendous amount with his life other than talk about how closely related to George Washington he was. And people would flock to Arlington House to sort of, see this connection, this living connection to the Washingtons, to see these relics. The actual tent was displayed out on the grounds of Arlington. So all in the 1800s, 1812 period, they would actually set up these tents and have parties under them. It's amazing anything is left to see. Custis would give these long orations, and it's great to read the newspaper. So the first couple of years, they would print a transcript of the whole speech, like for pages. And then they'd start to print like an executive summary. And then a couple years later, they would just say, and Mr. Custis gave his usual remarks on this occasion. And so on the 50th anniversary of the Revolution, on the eve of the 50th anniversary, the Marquis de Lafayette, who of course is a 19-year-old, had come to volunteer his service and had become kind of an adopted son of Washington's in the winning of American independence, returns for a tour of all of the new United States. He arrives at Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor in October of 1824. Now, it has been, basically just a decade since the British bombardment, the War of 1812, the British bombardment of Fort McHenry. So to greet Lafayette, who comes by steamship up the Patapsco River, they actually bring out the Star-Spangled Banner. And it's flapping, all bullet-ridden, flapping from the flagpole. And on the parade ground in Fort McHenry, they put the state militia all drawn up at attention under arms. And as Lafayette walks up with his entourage, they open their ranks. The stage management was beautiful. And set up behind them is Washington's tent. And under Washington's tent are officers from the Society of the Cincinnati, Revolutionary War veterans who had served with him, and Charles Carroll, who would be the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on July 4th, 1826. Lafayette goes there, breaks down in tears. Again, everyone is crying at this moment. He says, "I remember." And that very night in Baltimore, there was a dinner. This is John Quincy Adams. He's Secretary of State at this point, but he's about to be elected president, son of John Adams. Now, he was, in a way, a Revolutionary War veteran, too. At age 9, he and his mother, Abigail Adams, had climbed up on the roof of their house to listen to the far-off sound of the Battle of Bunker Hill. As I think an 11-year-old, he is aboard ship with John Adams heading on his diplomatic mission to Holland, and they come under fire from a British warship. And so he has heard bullets whistle in hostile bullets fly during the Revolutionary War. And that night at that dinner, Quincy Adams gives a toast, the tears of glory, gratitude, and joy shed under the tent of Washington. People have been crying in the presence of this object for a very, very long time. So here's GWPC, photographed by Matthew Brady right before his death in 1857. We like to say, fortunately, he died in 1857, because in the 1840s, he started cutting up those tents and giving pieces away as souvenirs. And we would not have anything left had he not lived a very full life, as you can see, and died. His daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, a lot of Virginia families had married together there to form that name, married a man who graduated first in his class from the United States Military Academy, Robert Edward Lee. Now, in 1861, as you all know, Robert E. Lee took a new job, which required him to leave his house very quickly at night. Here's Arlington, occupied by Union soldiers during the Revolutionary War. Of course, it's sitting on a very strategic height overlooking Washington, D.C. So Union soldiers occupy Arlington. It's left in the care of the woman on the right, a woman named Selina Gray, who was the enslaved servant for Mrs. Lee. So she ran the household at Arlington House. And she was left with the keys and told, "You're responsible." Now, just as an aside, we did an exhibition kind of basically telling the story I'm telling you 2 years ago at the museum. And we had tracked down some descendants of Selina Gray. So we had 3 cousins who were in their 70s who were there present that night. And we had blown this photograph up, sort of life-size on the wall. And I'm standing there, and they casually mentioned that this daughter of Selina Gray's lived to be over 100 years old, and that they knew her as children in the 1960s and used to visit her in Washington, D.C. And she told them stories about Arlington House. So it's a reminder that this history is actually not that remote from us. So General Irvin McDowell, you can always tell the general, he's a little fatter than everybody else, agrees to have the items that had been left at Arlington House, things like Martha Washington's china, which Selina Gray one day found one of her pieces of china trampled into the ground and broken. The tents are there, and there's a big hole cut out of the roof of one of the tents by a soldier. Books from the Custis and Washington libraries that had been taken by soldiers as souvenirs. So all of that material is taken into Washington, D.C. and put on display in the United States Patent Office. This is now the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian in Washington, but at the time is the Patent Office. So they're claiming the mantle of George Washington for the Union cause here. They put these items on display. They use it to raise money to support the Union cause. In 1876, the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, there's a stereoscopic card. This is Washington's dining marquee that's on display there. So these relics were brought out and continued to be in popular memory all through this period of time, including, this is Washington's mess chest from the period, some of the camp furniture, a uniform on display. 1905, the items have finally been returned to the Custis Lee family, who kept asserting that these were their objects. In 1901, President McKinley returns them to the family. So in 1905, Miss Mary Custis Lee, the daughter of Robert E. Lee, who would be the last surviving child of Robert E. Lee and is the great-great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, asked for the tents to be taken out and set up and photographed. And so this is basically on the mall of the Smithsonian, right next to the brick castle there. There's actually a garden in this area right now. So what you're seeing here is that bigger, remember the dining marquee that we started with? Well, there's the dining marquee. This is the roof of the sleeping and office tent that's at the Museum of the American Revolution now. Right here is a Smithsonian curator in a bowler hat, straw bowler, cooking with Washington's original camp mess chest over a fire, which is frowned upon by museum professionals now, I can assure you. And they'd actually set up Washington's telescope here on these little boards, so I presume so visitors could look down and look through Washington's telescope, which actually sounds kind of cool. But so that then is just a year before the article that we started with, because Miss Mary Custis Lee had been appointed a trustee for the Confederate Widows' Home, which was caring for the widows of men who had served under her father in the Army of Northern Virginia in Richmond. And so she thought, well, I'm going to sell one or both of these tents to raise money to care for these widows. She hoped that the patriotic citizens of Philadelphia would sort of club together and buy one or both of these tents. She said Independence Hall would be the perfect place to put them on display. This is actually the tent set up in the snow at Valley Forge. Again, really frowned upon by museum professionals today. But that was the work of this man on the left here, the Reverend W. Herbert Burke, who was an Episcopal priest in Norristown, Pennsylvania, near Valley Forge. That's Mary Custis Lee on the right. And Burke reads that newspaper account in 1906. It takes him 3 years to raise $500 as a down payment. He has a wonderful correspondence with Miss Lee. All of that correspondence fortunately survives at the museum. In the 1980s, where's Josh? See if this makes your skin crawl. In the 1980s, people were kind of like cleaning up and they're like, we got an awful lot of old paper here and everything. And they were about to throw away all of these old letters between Reverend Burke, including the original purchase agreement and all of the documentation, the letters that school children had sent enclosing their lunch money, the whole archive of the acquisition of this tent. But fortunately, somebody said, I think we should keep that. And so we've got it. Reverend Burke was already building what's known as the Washington Memorial Chapel at Valley Forge. And you can still visit this. It's right in the center of Valley Forge Park. And he had plans to build a Museum of American History next to it, which never got built. So there was a museum room actually in the chapel. And you see the tents there, the roof of the tent on display in the museum room. This was probably shot in the 1940s. We actually have some of the original admission tickets. So originally it was 10 cents toward the purchase of Washington's marquee, later raised to 15 cents. And I love the way they wrote things. So the removal of this coupon terminates the privilege of admission. We just lost the elegance of our language, I think. So today, when you all come to visit the museum, you will see the tent in a dedicated theater. And it starts as a film. And the story is very much like I've told you, but it's only 12 minutes long. But you'll recognize just a few of these screen grabs, and it's really the story that I've told you. I guarantee every time at this moment in the film, if you listen carefully, somebody in the audience will go, or, did you know that? Then you start to dramatically reveal the tent. When we unveiled this tent for the first time, the film in 2017 when the museum opened, took a couple weeks of installing the film, and there's a lot of lighting cues, and you have to like get a conservator in there with a light meter to say, are we putting too much light on the tent? So it wasn't just like plug it and it goes. And I'm watching this thing over and over and over again. Now keep in mind, I wrote the script, I storyboarded the entire thing, like every picture that's in there, and I now know what like Shakespeare must have felt like the night before, Hamlet is, and they talk about playwrights having this moment the night before where you're like, oh, this thing stinks. Because I wasn't feeling any emotion. It's like, oh no, like we just spent like $10 million on this theater and everything. And I told everybody, we're gonna do this. In fact, true story, in 2012, 5 years earlier, I went up to meet with David McCullough, the great American historian and storyteller, and talked him through what our plans were for the exhibits, and specifically for the tent. We had a watercolor drawing showing it revealed. And I said, oh, we're gonna tell this story, and then we're gonna reveal the tent. And he said, Scott, I wouldn't make that much of that tent. It's just a tent. And I was like, oh, and now it's like literally a week before we're opening. And by the way, David McCullough is our keynote speaker at the opening. A little nervous. So we had a chance to bring a group of 7th grade boys from a private school in Connecticut and give them a preview the week before the opening. So every seat in the theater's got a 7th grade boy in it. Now they were pretty attentive because it's a film at the beginning, and they're kind of paying attention. And I'm standing in the back, like looking over their shoulders. And this moment comes, and you're starting to see this outline. And the kid right in front of me like grabs the shoulder of the guy next to him and goes, I think that's the tent. And they're all kind of like looking like this. And then there's a moment where the lights come up and the music comes up and they all start cheering. And I started bawling like Lafayette. And now I watch it 10 times a week and I still get absolute chills. It culminates at the end. This is my Alfred Hitchcock moment. I play the shadow of George Washington in the film there. Incredibly moving. I mean, this is an actual recent review where someone said they'd never been moved as much by an exhibit as they were when they saw Washington's tent. If you go to TripAdvisor and just search the comments and just put in tent or tears, you will get dozens of accounts. So it is doing the work that tent has done for many, many years. Just to give you a little preview of the setting here, you recognize that painting. You didn't realize how big it was, did you? That's 15 by 17 feet. We call the museum a movie you can walk through because it is very immersive. Lots of exhibits of traditional, exhibits of artifacts. There's about 500 artifacts and works of art on display at any given time, but we also use media, immersive environments. This is a recreation of Boston's Liberty Tree. That's actually an embedded piece of the last surviving Liberty Tree that you can actually touch. Now there's also a touch screen in there, and I am pleased to report the kids are far more jazzed to touch this piece of wood and learn that they're connecting to this long ago period than they are to play with a computer. So just to give you a sense of the feel of the galleries, we've got this wonderful privateer ship that you can try on 18th century clothing, learn about fighting at sea in the 18th century. One of the other really moving moments is really right at the end of the galleries. And on the left-hand side, what you're seeing are photographs of people who were alive during the Revolutionary War, but lived into the age of photography, so after 1839. Some of them were children, some of them were soldiers that were at places like Valley Forge. There is a Seneca Indian man who was at the Battle of Oriskany who's photographed. Quakers, a man named Isaac Granger who was, consider the irony, he was born enslaved at Monticello to Thomas Jefferson in 1776, the very year that Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So it is in pictures the entire complicated, messy birth of the nation. And America's first greatest generation, the people who made a world in which subjects had a chance to become citizens. And as you go to the end of that gallery there, you see mirrors on the wall and just the simple words, "Meet the future of the American Revolution." And that is really the big message of what we do at the museum. I am less concerned that you know the specific dates of anything that happened, or that you can match a general with a battle, the way most of us were taught history. It's really, do you feel a kind of emotional, empathetic connection to people in this generation? Have we put you into their predicaments so that you kind of feel and you understand what they went through? Two quotes I'll leave you with. These are, again, visitor quotes, but I love these two. This visitor from Virginia, that might be the most effective part of this museum. It puts you in the place of society at the time. Revolutionaries, loyalists, slaves, Native Americans. Helps you appreciate the unlikelihood of it all, how impossible and fragile and uncertain and terrifying it all must have been. Man, if like my high school history teacher had made it feel like that, I was a B student at best. How many A students in social studies are we looking at here, right? Even though you all love history, it just drained all the passion out of it in the way it has traditionally been taught. And then I love this visitor from New York who talks about how it brings out the complexity and humanity of this tumultuous period without holding back on its dark side, but while preserving the radical optimism of its message. And you know, there's a lot of talk right now about patriotic history. It's the 250th now in 2026, and we need patriotic history. And my challenge to those who say, well, patriotic history means I don't want to hear anything that makes me uncomfortable, is A, that does not reflect the truth. And doesn't it make the achievement of that generation and all the generations since then so much greater? Can't we be proud and think of ourselves as a mature country that can admit the terrible errors that we have experienced as Americans, but that we always keep our eyes looking forward in our quest to be a more perfect union, to live up to those ideas that are expressed in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, which gives us a kind of tool to try to live up to those ideas. And as Winston Churchill once said about democracy, you know, it's the worst possible form of government, except every other one that's ever been tried. And so that, I think, is our challenge. That's what we should all be doing in the public history realm. You all are doing it at the Crawford County Historical Society. We're doing it at Allegheny College. I wanted to just end by showing you some Crawford County credentials, but also to point out, those of you who come to the museum this year are going to see our Declarations Journey exhibit, which is looking at 250 years of the Declaration starting in 1776. So as it goes out to the world, as it is shared with the American people, how has it inspired people of African descent? Immediately begin saying, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal, where do I sign, right? We have incredible objects from Frederick Douglass, a copy of the Columbian orator that he purchased while he was enslaved, and taught himself to read using this book and kept it for his entire life. I mean, I walk up to that in a case and you can just feel the electric cord shaking you. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's desk on loan to us from her great-great-granddaughter. Incredible objects from around the world, looking at all the nations that have been created inspired by the Declaration of Independence. But I also want to show you my grandfather as a football player at Allegheny College in about 1935. And I want to show you my parents, Judy Trohaw and Bob Stephenson, class of 62. This is my father leaving on the train from Meadville he was a community ambassador for Meadville to go to England in 1961. He had borrowed my mother's camera here. This is a great beloved family story. And he was bragging to her about this amazing, actually it wasn't hers, he had borrowed this camera and he was going to take all these pictures when he was in England. He's showing her like all the bells and whistles and he said, look here, you turn this thing here and you can adjust it for the wind. And she said, Bob, that's where you wind the film. And he was not joking. That's me on the flagship Niagara 50 years ago, before they refloated it. So it used to be just dry docked there on the waterfront with my father, my Uncle Lyle, my Uncle Jim, my grandfather there, my cousins, my brother who is the ADD one who was always climbing up like a monkey up there. But just to say, as I reflect on the moment we're in now, this is the 250th, and I think back as a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old at the time of the bicentennial. Like, that is a moment that implanted in me all of the excitement and curiosity and interest that led to a career, which I did not imagine I would be a historian and a museum director at that time, but it actually, I think, made me a much more engaged and better citizen because I had great storytellers in my life. My grandfather, who would drive around up here in Crawford County. And have you ever been to Pit Hole before? That was like a huge city. You know, and I remember I'm looking like, Grandpa, that's a field and woods, you know? No, it was a vast city. And so, you know, that kind of narrative, that kind of storytelling, and so much of the important work happens in the communities. It's the preservation of the objects in these archives by these communities. I'm a rabid family history buff. I got some distant cousins from the Clay family over here tonight. And so I've done like the genealogy and the DNA, right? So ancestry DNA. And there's something about the Clay family of Crawford County. These people were fertile, I am telling you. There are so many people that pop up, and I mean not just around the country, around the world, who I'm connected to, right? And it's only 3 generations back that they started spreading around. And I've been thinking the last couple days, you know, just because it was St. Patrick's Day, when everybody is Irish, right? But we're used to thinking about like a homeland, like Ireland, or West Africa, or a place, Germany, that is a hearth, a cultural hearth that sends people out into the world. But, you know, Crawford County is, just through my Clay family, I can show you on a map that this is a cultural hearth that has been really significant in shaping American history. And there are people, I think, who maybe we can help them reconnect to this place. And it depends on saving the landscapes and the buildings and the objects and the archives. And so I know everyone in this room already understands this, and you're all members of the Crawford County Historical Society, or you better renew if you're not. But anyway, so I just want to thank you for the opportunity to bend your ear. I saw none of these kind of nods, so thank you for these kind of nods. And I know we're going to gather you know, for the rest of the evening. I'm in it to win it, so I'll be here till the lights go out. Anyway, thank you all. Fantastic.